I'm revoking your freight portfolio, he announced, proud. The words hung in the air like diesel fumes over a loading dock. 4 years of building trade routes across 3 oceans, gone in a single sentence. My hand stayed steady on the desk, even as I watched Roger Pemberton's smug expression settle into something resembling victory. They erased my name from every ocean manifest index by noon. By 2 a.m., I received the alerts. The cargo distribution terminals had locked. Every single screen flashed the same message in aggressive red letters. Primary charter sign-off required. The $420 million container pipeline I'd architected from raw concept to operational reality stalled at dawn. The shipping office froze. But there was one thing Roger hadn't counted on. One detail his arrogance had overlooked in his rush to dismantle what I'd built. I was the vessel Lease they couldn't erase. Stories about corporate warfare, about power plays in glass towers, they happen every day. But what happens when the person holding the keys refuses to hand them over? What happens when the very foundation of a company's future rests in the hands of the person they just betrayed? Welcome to the Payback Office channel, where justice isn't just served, it's strategically executed. This is where we explore the moments when underdogs remind their opponents exactly why they were irreplaceable in the first place. The stories shared here are about calculated comebacks and well-deserved consequences. If these kinds of stories resonate with something in you, if you believe that accountability matters in the workplace, consider subscribing. We're building a community on our way to 7,000 subscribers, people who understand that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting karma do the heavy lifting while you hold all the cards. My name is Cassandra Hayes. I still am, on paper, the Director of Maritime Operations for North Point Shipping Solutions. My father drove delivery trucks in Ohio for 30 years. My mother managed inventory at a warehouse that smelled perpetually of cardboard and coffee. They taught me that hard work matters, but they also taught me that understanding people, really understanding what drives them, what scares them, what they need, that's the real currency in any industry. Empathy isn't weakness, it's intelligence. And intelligence was exactly what I needed when everything I'd built started crumbling at the hands of a man who'd never spent a single night worrying about container weight distribution or customs documentation. Let me take you back to where this really began. 3 months before Roger Pemberton tried to erase me from the company, I was standing on a dock in Seattle at 5 in the morning, watching a shipment of automotive parts get loaded onto the Empress Catherine, a vessel I'd personally negotiated the lease for 8 months prior. The container ship was magnificent in the early dawn light, all industrial efficiency and raw power. 23,000 TEU capacity, retrofitted with the latest emissions reduction technology, and operating on a route optimization algorithm I'd spent 6 months developing with our tech team. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" The voice came from behind me. I turned to find James Kozlowski, our CFO, holding 2 paper cups of what smelled like burnt terminal coffee. "She's profitable," I replied, accepting the cup, "which makes her even more beautiful." James laughed. "That's why the board loves you, Cassandra. You speak their language." What James didn't know, what I wouldn't discover for another 72 hours, was that the board had just approved a restructuring plan. One that involved bringing in fresh leadership for the maritime division. One that had Roger Pemberton's name attached to it as incoming VP of Shipping Operations. My boss, my new boss. A man whose entire maritime experience consisted of a summer sailing a yacht in the Hamptons and an MBA from a school where connections mattered more than competence. The first time I met Roger was in a conference room that overlooked Elliott Bay. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my first car and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Cassandra Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard impressive things." "Mr. Pemberton," I replied, matching his grip. "Welcome to the team." "Please, Roger, we're going to be working very closely together." He settled into the chair at the head of the table, the chair I'd occupied for every maritime operations meeting for the past 4 years. "I've been reviewing your routes, your vessel contracts, your distribution models. And And I think there's room for optimization. Significant room. He opened a leather portfolio, sliding a document across the table. I've had consultants from Highbridge Maritime Advisory run some numbers. I scanned the document, my jaw tightened with each line. They wanted to cut the Empress Catherine lease. Reroute 70% of our Pacific operations through third-party carriers. Eliminate our proprietary tracking system in favor of an off-the-shelf solution that would save money in year 1 and cost us millions in competitive advantage by year 3. These consultants, I said carefully, did they account for the seasonal variations in Pacific trade winds? The customs relationships we've built in Singapore and Tokyo? The fact that our proprietary tracking system reduced our loss claims by 42%. Roger's smile thinned. They accounted for shareholder value, Cassandra. That's what matters. Shareholder value built on unsustainable short-term gains isn't value. It's a house of cards. That sounds like resistance to innovation. That sounds like experience talking. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Over the next 2 months, every meeting became a battlefield. Roger would propose changes designed to demonstrate quick wins to the board. I would present data showing why those changes would damage our long-term operations. The board, caught between Roger's polished presentations and my operational track record, waffled. But Roger was patient. More importantly, he was political. He started having lunches with board members I'd never had access to. He brought in external analysts who validated his perspectives. He slowly, methodically built a narrative. Cassandra Hayes was brilliant but stuck in her ways. Brilliant but resistant to change. Brilliant but perhaps not the right fit for where Northpoint Shipping Solutions needed to go. I saw it happening, watched the tides shift in real time. My ally in accounting, Monica, who'd helped me navigate budget approvals for years, started being noticeably cooler in our interactions. The operations coordinator who'd always prioritized my urgent requests started adding delays. Small things, death by 1,000 paper cuts. He's building a case, warned Thomas, one of the senior logistics managers who'd been with the company longer than anyone. I've seen this before. He's going to move against you, Cassandra. You need to protect yourself. I have documentation of everything I've built here. The routes, the contracts, the relationships. Documentation doesn't matter if you're not in the room to present it. Thomas was right. He was always right about office politics, which is probably why he'd survived 4 different regime changes. I started keeping copies of everything. Not just digital files, but hard copies stored off-site. Emails, contracts, vendor relationships, the access codes and passwords to systems only I had maintained, including the vessel leases. Especially the vessel leases. The Empress Catherine was the crown jewel, but there were 6 other vessels operating under contracts I'd personally negotiated. Contracts that, due to a quirk of how they'd been originally structured, required my direct sign-off for any modifications or transfers. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable clause. I was director of maritime operations. Of course, major vessel decisions would run through me. The legal team had approved it. Finance had signed off. Nobody had imagined a scenario where someone would try to operate the maritime division without me. Nobody except Roger, apparently, who hadn't bothered to read the fine print. The axe fell on a Tuesday. I was in my office reviewing manifests for an incoming shipment from Shanghai when my calendar pinged. Emergency meeting, conference room A, 3 p.m. No agenda, no context. I knew before I walked in what was coming. You develop an instinct for these things. Roger was there. So was Helen Yamamoto from HR, wearing her professional sympathy expression. James from finance looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. And Bernard Ashworth, the CEO, sat at the head of the table looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Cassandra, thank you for joining us, Bernard began. Please sit. I'll stand. A flicker of something crossed Roger's face. Annoyance, maybe, or anticipation. We'll keep this brief, Bernard continued. The company is moving in a new strategic direction with our maritime operations. We've determined that this transition requires fresh leadership perspectives. Effective immediately, you're being moved to a special projects advisory role. Advisory role, the corporate equivalent of being sent to Siberia. You're removing me from maritime operations, I said, not a question. You'll retain your title and compensation while we transition your responsibilities, Helen added quickly, as if that softened anything. Transition to whom? Roger leaned forward. I'll be assuming direct oversight of day-to-day maritime operations. Your expertise will be invaluable during the knowledge transfer period, of course. Of course. I looked at each of them in turn. Bernard wouldn't meet my eyes. James was studying his notepad. Helen maintained her professional mask. Only Roger looked directly at me, and in his expression I saw it clearly: triumph. I'll need your access credentials to all maritime systems, Roger continued. Port Authority logins, vessel tracking interfaces, cargo management platforms. Let's plan to meet tomorrow morning to begin the transition. Tomorrow's quite soon. No point in delaying the inevitable, Roger said. This company needs to move forward. I nodded slowly. I'll compile everything you'll need. The meeting ended. I walked back to my office on steady legs, closed the door, and allowed myself exactly 3 minutes of pure rage. Fists clenched, jaw tight, breathing hard. Then I got to work. They gave me a week to transition my knowledge. 7 days to hand over 4 years of relationships, systems, and institutional knowledge to a man who thought maritime operations was primarily about spreadsheets and cost-cutting. I was professional, courteous even. I created detailed documentation of every active route, provided passwords to most systems, explained the relationships with port authorities in Long Beach, Seattle, and Oakland, walked Roger through the customs protocols for our primary Asian shipping partners. But there were things I didn't mention, small things. I didn't mention that our primary contact at the Port of Seattle, a woman named Grace, required a very specific protocol for rush clearances, and that protocol was based on a personal favor I'd done for her brother 2 years ago. I didn't mention that the tracking system had a backup authentication requirement that kicked in every 30 days, a security feature I'd insisted on after we'd had a minor hacking attempt, and that backup required biometric confirmation linked to my profile. And I definitely didn't mention the structure of the vessel leases. Roger assumed, as most people would, that vessel contracts were corporate agreements. Company signs with shipping vessel owner, company pays fees, company gets access to vessel. Simple. But the Empress Catherine and 6 other vessels in our fleet weren't leased through standard corporate channels. They were leased through a maritime contract structure called a primary charter arrangement, where a specific individual, in this case, me, held the legal designation as the charter signatory. It was an older arrangement, common in shipping decades ago, less so now, but when I'd been negotiating these contracts, the vessel owners had preferred it. More personal accountability. A single point of contact they trusted. The company's legal team had approved it because, functionally, it didn't matter. I worked for Northpoint. My charter authority was exercised on behalf of Northpoint. Everyone got what they wanted. Unless, of course, someone tried to operate those vessels without the charter signatory's approval. I discovered what Roger was planning on a Friday evening. I'd technically been transitioned out of my role, moved to an empty office on a different floor, my calendar suddenly and suspiciously free. I still had access to my email, though. Corporate IT hadn't shut that down yet. That's how I saw the message from Roger to Bernard and the board. Maritime Operations Restructuring, Phase 2 Implementation. The email laid it out clearly. Roger wasn't just taking over my operations, he was dismantling them. The Empress Catherine lease would be terminated. Our proprietary tracking system would be discontinued. 70% of our routes would be outsourced to third-party carriers, specifically to Westmore Shipping, a company that, after 15 minutes of research, I discovered had financial ties to one of Roger's former colleagues. The restructuring would save the company approximately $4 million in year 1. It would also destroy every competitive advantage we'd built, damage relationships with partners who valued consistency, and likely cost us triple that amount within 18 months. But it would make Roger look good to the board, at least initially. The implementation was scheduled to begin the following Monday. I sat in my empty office, reading and rereading the email. Part of me wanted to just walk away. Update my resume, call some contacts, find a new position at a company that would actually value expertise over politics. But there was another part, the part that sounded like my father's voice, steady and certain, that said, "They don't get to erase what you built. Not like this." I opened my personal files, found the vessel contracts, read through the charter provisions carefully. Then I made a call. "Covenant Maritime Legal, this is Andrew speaking." "Andrew, this is Cassandra Hayes. I need advice on maritime charter law, specifically regarding primary signatory provisions in vessel lease agreements." The conversation lasted 45 minutes. When it ended, I understood exactly what I was holding. The vessel leases I'd signed weren't just contracts with my name on them. They were legally binding agreements that designated me, personally, as the charter authority. Any modifications, transfers, or operational changes to those vessels required my explicit written consent. Not the company's consent, mine. "Can the company override that?" I'd asked Andrew. "They can try to litigate, but maritime contract law is very specific about charter provisions. If you signed as primary charter holder and that designation wasn't explicitly transferred in writing, then you retain that authority. It's designed to protect vessel owners from corporate restructuring chaos. So if I don't approve changes, then those vessels can't be legally operated under modified terms. The company can use them under the existing charter provisions, but they can't terminate, transfer, or restructure the agreements without your sign-off." I thanked Andrew, ended the call, and pulled up the list of vessels under my charter authority. Empress Catherine, 23,000 TEU container ship, Pacific routes. Northern Starlight, 14,000 TEU container ship, Trans-Pacific. Oceanic Venture, 18,500 TEU container ship, Asia West Coast routes. Pacific Horizon, 12,000 TEU container ship, short-haul coastal. Maritime Crown, 15,500 TEU container ship, Seattle-Tokyo route. Harbor Excellence, 11,000 TEU container ship, specialized cargo. Coastal Dynasty, 16,000 TEU container ship, multi-route operations. 7 vessels, combined capacity of over 110,000 TEU, representing approximately 78% of Northpoint's total shipping capacity. All legally under my charter authority. Roger wanted to restructure maritime operations. He'd need my signature. Segment 7. I didn't tell anyone what I discovered. Not yet. Monday morning arrived. I came into the office at my usual time, 5:30 a.m., and settled into my new, smaller office. Made coffee, checked email. At 9 a.m., the first message arrived. From Roger, marked urgent. "Cassandra, we're encountering a technical issue with the Empress Catherine manifest system. Can you provide emergency override credentials? Need immediate access to finalize route modifications." I waited 30 minutes before responding. The system should be accessible with the credentials I provided last week. If there's an authentication issue, it should be able to resolve it. 12 minutes later, Roger again. "It says this requires charter-level authorization. They gave me your documentation, but something's not processing correctly." "Interesting. What modifications are you attempting?" 4 minutes. "That's outside your current role scope. I need the authorization credentials." I sipped my coffee, composed my response. Maritime charter authorizations are legally complex. I'd be happy to schedule a meeting to discuss the specifics of what you're trying to accomplish. The response came almost immediately. "My office, 10 a.m., be there." Roger's office, formerly the Maritime Operations suite that I'd occupied for 4 years, looked different. He'd removed the maps of shipping routes, the models of container ships, the certifications from various maritime authorities. In their place, generic corporate art and a massive whiteboard covered in financial projections. "We have a problem," Roger said without preamble. "What kind of problems?" The vessel systems aren't accepting my authorization for the restructuring changes. Every time I attempt to modify the charter terms, it kicks back an error requesting primary signatory approval. He fixed me with a hard stare. You're listed as the primary signatory. Yes. Why? Because when I negotiated those contracts, that's how the vessel owners wanted them structured. Personal accountability. It's a fairly common arrangement in maritime. I don't care about common arrangements. I care about implementing the strategic changes this company needs. I need you to transfer that authority to me. I settled into the chair across from his desk. That's not quite how charter authority works. Then explain how it works. Maritime charter agreements designate a primary signatory who holds legal responsibility for the vessel operations under that contract. The signatory can authorize modifications, but transferring the signatory designation itself requires consent from all parties, me, the company, and the vessel owners. Roger's jaw tightened, so contact the vessel owners, get their consent. That would require explaining why the transfer is necessary. They'd want to know why the current primary signatory is being replaced. They'd want assurances that the operational relationships they've relied on will continue. They'd want. I don't have time for this bureaucratic nonsense. Maritime law isn't nonsense, Roger. It's protection. For the vessel owners, for the charter holders, and yes, for the company. He stood, pacing behind his desk. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to provide me with whatever authorizations I need to implement the restructuring plan. You're going to do it today. And then we're going to work with legal to transfer all these charters into proper corporate structure where they belong. And if I decline? The temperature in the room plummeted. Decline? Roger's voice was soft, dangerous. You're an employee of this company, Cassandra. You don't have the option to decline a direct operational requirement. I'm an employee who holds legally binding charter authority, granted through properly executed maritime contracts. Those contracts don't terminate simply because my internal job title changed. Are you actually trying to hold company operations hostage? I'm explaining the legal reality of the agreements I signed on this company's behalf. Roger grabbed his phone. We'll see what Bernard has to say about this. The emergency executive meeting was called for 2 p.m. Bernard, Roger, Helen from HR, James from Finance, and Patricia Greenwald, the company's general counsel. Patricia had the vessel contracts spread across the conference table. She'd been reading them for the past 3 hours, her expression growing progressively more concerned. Is it true? Bernard demanded. These charters legally require Cassandra's personal authorization. Patricia nodded. The contracts are properly executed maritime charter agreements with designated primary signatory provisions. Miss Hayes signed them in that capacity. Legally, she retains charter authority until that designation is explicitly transferred with consent from all parties, including the vessel owners. This is insane, Roger said. She's an employee. She signed these on behalf of the company. She signed them as the designated charter holder on behalf of the company, Patricia corrected. There's a distinction in maritime law. The charter holder carries personal legal accountability for the vessel operations. That's why vessel owners prefer this structure. They have a specific individual accountable, not just a corporate entity. Bernard looked at me. Cassandra, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here? I'm not trying to accomplish anything. I negotiated these contracts the way the vessel owners required. The company approved them. Legal signed off on them. They've functioned perfectly well for years. Until now, Roger interjected. Until you're apparently using them to obstruct necessary business operations. I'm not obstructing anything. The vessels are operating under their current charter terms. If you want to modify those terms, maritime law requires the charter holder's consent. That's me. So give consent, Bernard said. It wasn't quite an order, but it was close. I met his eyes. I'd need to understand what modifications are being proposed and whether they align with the operational commitments these charters represent. Roger slammed his hand on the table. The modifications are terminating these expensive charter arrangements and moving to a more cost-effective third-party carrier model. That's the modification. Now approve it. No. The word hung in the air. Bernard's face reddened. Excuse me. The charter agreements include operational performance commitments to our shipping partners. Terminating them abruptly would violate those commitments, expose the company to breach of contract claims, and damage relationships we've spent years building. I won't approve modifications that harm the company's long-term interests. You don't get to make that determination, Roger said. Actually, Patricia interjected quietly, in her capacity as charter holder, she does. That's the whole point of the designation. The charter holder has legal authority to ensure the charter terms are properly maintained. Bernard stood abruptly. I want solutions. Patricia, what are our options? We can negotiate with Miss Hayes to voluntarily transfer the charter designations. We can negotiate with the vessel owners to restructure the agreements. Or we can litigate, though maritime charter law is very well established, and I wouldn't be optimistic about our chances. How long would litigation take? Months, possibly years. And during that time, we'd still need Miss Hayes's authorization to make any charter modifications. Roger's face had gone from red to nearly purple. This is blackmail. This is maritime contract law, I replied calmly. They tried everything over the next 48 hours. Helen from HR called me in for a meeting about workplace cooperation expectations. I listened politely, then explained that I was cooperating fully. The charters were operating exactly as contracted, and I was available to discuss any operationally sound modifications. James from finance tried a gentler approach. Cassandra, I understand your concerns, but the board is pressuring us on costs. Roger's restructuring plan shows significant savings. Can we at least discuss a compromise? Show me a restructuring plan that doesn't violate our existing shipping commitments or destroy our competitive advantages, and I'll consider it. Roger's not going to agree to that. Then Roger has a problem. The real pressure came Thursday morning. I arrived at my office to find my access badge deactivated. My company email was suspended. My parking space was reassigned. I called Patricia directly. Are they actually trying to lock me out? She sighed. Roger convinced Bernard that you're acting in bad faith. They're treating this as an employee discipline issue. I'm fulfilling my legal obligations as a charter holder. I explained that multiple times, but Roger's adamant and Bernard's under pressure from the board about the stalled restructuring. Patricia, what happens to those vessels if I don't approve operational modifications? They continue operating under the current charter terms, which means Northpoint can use them, but can't terminate or restructure the agreements. And if Northpoint tries to operate them without proper charter authorization? A pause. That would violate the charter agreements and potentially the vessel's maritime insurance policies. The vessel owners could pull the leases entirely. So Roger literally cannot restructure maritime operations without my cooperation. Correct. I thanked her and ended the call. Sat in my office, the small, windowless one they'd relegated me to, and considered my options. I could cave, sign whatever Roger wanted, update my resume and move on. Or I could stand my ground. My phone buzzed. A text from Thomas, the logistics manager. Emergency at the terminals, you need to see this. I drove to the cargo distribution terminal in Tacoma. Thomas met me at the gate. Security tried to stop me, but Thomas vouched for my access. Inside the operations center, chaos. Screens flashing error messages. Operators on phones, voices tense. The massive board showing vessel positions and cargo status was lit up like a Christmas tree, every status indicator yellow or red. What happened? I asked. Thomas pulled me aside. Roger tried to force through the charter modifications using some kind of emergency override authorization. He got it to create fake credentials claiming CEO approval. Started processing the vessel terminations about 3 hours ago. And the charter management system rejected them. But not before the termination requests hit the vessel owner systems. Now we've got 7 vessel owners demanding clarification. Our cargo tracking system is locked because it can't reconcile the conflicting authorizations, and the insurance underwriters are threatening to suspend coverage until the charter status is clarified. I looked at the chaos unfolding across the operations center. Where's Roger? In the main office. He's been on the phone with Bernard for the past hour. I walked to the terminal supervisor's office. Roger was there, phone pressed to his ear, his expression somewhere between panic and rage. He saw me, his eyes narrowed. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, then hung up. This is your fault." My fault? I'm not the one who tried to force through unauthorized charter modifications. Those vessels belong to this company. Those vessels are leased to this company under charter agreements that specify how they can be modified. You tried to circumvent the legal process, and now you've created exactly the kind of crisis those provisions were designed to prevent. Fix this. Excuse me. Roger stepped closer. You're the charter holder. Call the vessel owners, straighten this out, fix the mess your obstruction created. The mess my obstruction created. Roger, I didn't try to terminate 7 vessel charters using fraudulent authorization credentials. I had CEO approval. CEO approval doesn't override maritime charter law. Patricia explained this to you multiple times. Roger's hands clenched. For a moment, I genuinely thought he might try to physically intimidate me. But Thomas stepped into the doorway, his presence a subtle reminder that we weren't alone. Roger's phone rang. He glanced at it and something in his expression shifted. Fear, maybe, he answered. Yes, Bernard. I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but I watched Roger's face cycle through shock, disbelief, and finally resignation. Understood, he said finally. I'll handle it. He ended the call, stood there for a moment, silent. The vessel owners are threatening to terminate all 7 charters, he said quietly. For breach of contract. Bernard wants you in his office in 1 hour. Bernard Ashworth's corner office overlooked Elliott Bay. On a clear day, the view was spectacular. Today, low clouds turned everything gray. Patricia was already there when I arrived. So was Roger, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 6 hours. Cassandra, Bernard began without preamble, we need to resolve this. Today. I agree. He blinked, clearly having expected resistance. The vessel owners are threatening to pull all 7 charters. They're claiming we violated the charter terms by attempting unauthorized modifications. If they follow through, we lose 78% of our shipping capacity. That's correct. Can you convince them not to? Probably. I have strong relationships with all 7 owners. They trust me. Relief flooded Bernard's face. Then please make those calls. Explain this was a misunderstanding. Get us back to stable ground. I will, under certain conditions. The relief evaporated. Conditions. I looked directly at Roger. I returned to my position as Director of Maritime Operations. Full authority, full access. Roger moves to a different division. I don't care which one, but he's out of maritime. Roger exploded. Absolutely not, you can't. I can, I interrupted calmly. I'm the charter holder. The vessel owners trust me. You just tried to terminate their contracts using fraudulent credentials. Who do you think they want managing these operations? Bernard held up a hand. Cassandra, I understand you're upset about how the transition was handled. This isn't about being upset. This is about operational reality. Roger's restructuring plan was going to damage this company. The vessel owners know it. Our shipping partners know it. The only people who didn't know it were the board members impressed by cost-cutting projections that didn't account for long-term consequences. The board approved that restructuring, Bernard said carefully. Then the board made a mistake, and now we're facing the consequences. 7 vessel owners are ready to pull contracts worth hundreds of millions in shipping capacity. Our cargo terminals are in chaos. Our tracking systems are locked. We have containers sitting at ports across the Pacific with no clear routing. This is what happens when you prioritize politics over expertise. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Patricia spoke. Bernard, she's right. The vessel owners won't negotiate with Roger after this. They might not even negotiate with you. Cassandra is our only avenue to resolve this crisis. Bernard's jaw worked. He looked at Roger, who was staring at the floor. If I agree to your conditions, Bernard said slowly, can you guarantee the vessel owners will maintain the charters? I can't guarantee anything, but I can tell you that I've built relationships with these owners over 4 years. I've delivered on every commitment I've made to them. They know I understand maritime operations and that I respect the charter agreements. If anyone can repair the damage from the past 48 hours, it's me. Another long silence. Fine, Bernard said. Roger, you're moving to strategic development. Cassandra, you're reinstated as Director of Maritime Operations effective immediately. Fix this. The first call I made was to Chen Industries. Then I immediately remembered they weren't involved in these contracts. I scrolled to the correct contact. Franklin Maritime Holdings, owners of the Empress Catherine. Arthur Franklin answered on the second ring. Miss Hayes, I was hoping to hear from you. Arthur, I apologize for the chaos of the past 2 days. Chaos is an understatement. We received charter termination notices with authorization credentials we couldn't verify, contradicting the charter terms we agreed to. What's happening at North Point? Internal restructuring that wasn't properly coordinated with legal requirements. The person who initiated those termination notices has been removed from maritime operations. I'm back in my role as director, and I'm calling to reaffirm our commitment to the charter agreement as originally structured. A pause. The person who tried to terminate our contract, they're gone. Moved to a completely different division. They'll have no involvement in maritime operations going forward. And you have full authority. As Director of Maritime Operations, and as the primary charter holder, yes. Another pause. I could hear papers rustling on his end. Cassandra, I've worked with a lot of shipping companies. Most of them treat vessel owners like interchangeable vendors. You've always treated us as partners. That matters. Partnership is the only way maritime operations work long-term. Agreed, okay. Franklin Maritime will maintain the charter, but I want quarterly check-ins, direct with you. I want to know if there are any more restructuring attempts before they hit our systems. You have my word. 6 more calls, each one similar. Initial tension, explanation of what happened, reassurance about my restored authority, and finally, agreement to maintain the charters. By 6 p.m., all 7 vessels were secured. The cargo terminals began processing again. The tracking systems unlocked. The $420 million container pipeline that had stalled at dawn 3 days ago started flowing again. I sent a summary email to Bernard and Patricia. All vessel charters confirmed and secured. Operations returning to normal capacity. Recommend legal review of charter management protocols to prevent future unauthorized modification attempts. Bernard's response came within minutes. Excellent work. Board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Please attend. The board meeting felt like vindication and validation, rolled into one. Bernard presented the crisis timeline to the 12 board members. The restructuring attempt, the charter complications, the operational chaos, and the resolution. To be clear, Bernard concluded, we came within hours of losing our entire maritime shipping capacity because we didn't properly understand the charter agreements that Miss Hayes had negotiated. Her expertise, and more importantly, the relationships she'd built with vessel owners, saved this company from catastrophic operational failure. One of the board members, an older gentleman named Harrison, spoke up. This raises questions about the restructuring plan we approved, if it was going to cause this kind of chaos. The restructuring plan, I interjected carefully, was designed to show short-term cost savings without adequately accounting for long-term operational requirements or contractual commitments. With respect, the analysis presented to the board was incomplete. You're saying we made the wrong decision, Harrison said, not accusatory, just factual. I'm saying the decision was made with incomplete information. Maritime operations are complex. Charter agreements, vessel relationships, port authority protocols, customs partnerships, These aren't line items on a spreadsheet. They're relationships that take years to build and can be destroyed in days. Another board member, Angela, leaned forward. What would you recommend for maritime operations going forward? I'd prepared for this question, had spent the previous evening drafting a proposal. 3 things. First, maintain the current charter agreements and vessel relationships. They're profitable and operationally sound. Second, invest in upgrading our tracking and logistics technology, not replacing it with off-the-shelf solutions, but enhancing what we've built with better integration and analytics. Third, expand our routes strategically, focusing on emerging markets in Southeast Asia where we have relationship advantages. Cost. Initial investment of approximately $6 million over 18 months. Projected revenue increase of $20 to $30 million annually within 3 years. James from finance nodded. I've reviewed her preliminary numbers. They're conservative but realistic. The board members exchanged glances. It seems, Harrison said dryly, that we should have consulted the maritime operations expert about maritime operations before attempting to restructure them. Nervous laughter around the table. Bernard cleared his throat. Cassandra, the board and I owe you an apology. The transition was handled poorly. Your expertise was undervalued. That won't happen again. I appreciate that. We'd like to formalize your role with a new contract. Increased authority, increased compensation, and a seat at the table for any future strategic planning that involves maritime operations. I nodded. I'd want one additional provision. Which is? Any future charter agreements or major operational contracts include clear documentation of how they integrate with corporate structure. What happened over the past week was partially possible because the charter designations weren't clearly understood by leadership. Let's make sure that never happens again. Agreed, Bernard said. Patricia, work with Cassandra on updated contract language and corporate policy documentation. The meeting concluded. Board members approached me individually, some apologizing, some asking questions about maritime operations, one asking for advice on a completely unrelated shipping investment. I left the building at sunset. The sky over Elliott Bay was clear, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. My phone buzzed, a text from Thomas. Heard you crush the board meeting, drinks to celebrate. I smiled, rain check, I have work to do. The following weeks were a study in organizational recalibration. Roger was officially transferred to strategic development, a department that, as far as I could tell, existed primarily to keep him away from anything operational. We passed each other in hallways occasionally. He never made eye contact. I returned to my old office, the one with windows overlooking the bay, with my route maps and ship models and maritime certifications. Everything exactly as I'd left it, except for one addition. A framed copy of the charter agreement for the Empress Catherine, with the primary signatory provision highlighted. Patricia had it framed and delivered with a note, a reminder that sometimes the fine print saves the day. I hired 2 new analysts for the maritime operations team, both with actual shipping industry experience. Implemented the technology upgrades I'd proposed. Started preliminary negotiations on 3 new routes in Southeast Asia. The work was consuming, but it was my work, what I'd built, what I understood. Monica from accounting stopped by my office one afternoon. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. When Roger was talking about you being resistant to change, I should have known better. I've seen what you've built here. Roger was convincing, I replied, and he had the board's support. You were being practical. I was being political. That's different. Sometimes they're the same thing. She smiled ruefully. Maybe, but I wanted you to know there are people here who are glad you're back, who know what you prevented. After she left, I sat at my desk and thought about what had happened, about corporate politics and expertise and the thin line between confidence and arrogance. Roger had assumed that because he had authority, he had control. He'd assumed that titles mattered more than relationships, that restructuring plans mattered more than operational reality. He'd been wrong. But more than that, he'd made the critical mistake of not understanding what he was trying to control. He'd seen vessel charters as paperwork, shipping routes as spreadsheet lines, port relationships as vendor management. He'd never understood that maritime operations are fundamentally about trust. Trust between charter holders and vessel owners. Trust between shipping coordinators and port authorities. Trust between logistics managers and customs officials. Trust that takes years to build and moments to destroy. I'd built that trust, and when someone tried to erase me, that trust was what I had left. 3 months after my reinstatement, I stood on a dock in Seattle at dawn, watching a new vessel arrive. The Pacific Meridian, not that Meridian, just a coincidence of naming, was our newest charter addition. A 19,000 TEU container ship with cutting-edge emissions technology, negotiated through contacts I'd developed during the crisis. Arthur Franklin from Franklin Maritime Holdings stood beside me, watching the ship maneuver into position. "She's impressive," he said. "She's going to open up new routes we couldn't handle with our previous capacity," I replied. "You know," Arthur said, "when Roger tried to terminate our charters, I had conversations with the other vessel owners. We all agreed, if North Point had actually removed you from maritime operations, we were all planning to pull our contracts." I looked at him surprised. "All of you?" "All of us. We've worked with a lot of shipping companies, Cassandra. Most of them see vessels as assets to be optimized. You see them as partnerships. That's rare, and it's valuable." "I didn't know you'd discussed it." He smiled. "Why do you think we all agreed so quickly to maintain the charters when you called? It wasn't just about you being the charter holder. It was about you being someone we trusted to manage these relationships properly." The Pacific Meridian's horn sounded, deep and resonant across the water. "We should probably go meet the captain," Arthur said. "Probably." We walked toward the terminal building. The early morning sun caught the windows of the North Point Shipping Solutions headquarters in the distance, reflecting gold. I thought about trust again, about how it's built through competence and consistency, about how it becomes leverage not through manipulation, but through mutual respect. Roger had tried to erase me from the manifests, from the systems, from the operations I'd built. But he'd never understood that some things can't be erased. Relationships, trust, expertise. The vessel leases had been my legal protection, but the relationships I'd built were what actually saved me. And in the end, that made all the difference. 6 months later, North Point Shipping Solutions posted record quarterly earnings. The Southeast Asia routes I'd developed were exceeding projections. The technology upgrades had reduced operational costs by 18% while improving tracking accuracy by 32%. Bernard called me into his office on a Wednesday afternoon. He looked tired but pleased. "The board wants to offer you a VP position," he said. "Vice President of Global Maritime Strategy. Larger team, broader authority, significant compensation increase." "I'm interested," I replied, "but I have conditions." He laughed. "Of course you do. What are they?" "I want final approval authority on any maritime-related restructuring proposals. I want quarterly presentations to the board on maritime operations, not just financial metrics, but operational context. And I want a formalized mentorship program for bringing new talent into maritime operations. Because this industry needs people who understand that relationships matter as much as spreadsheets." Bernard considered this. "Done. Anything else?" "Actually, yes. I want Roger Pemberton to stay at North Point." Bernard blinked. "What's why?" "Because he's learning. I've seen the work he's doing in strategic development. He's actually listening to operational teams now, asking questions before making pronouncements. He made catastrophic mistakes in maritime operations, but that doesn't mean he can't be valuable in the right role." "That's generous." "That's strategic. Talent is talent. It just needs to be in the right position." Bernard shook his head, smiling. "You're more forgiving than I'd be." "I'm not forgiving anything. I'm recognizing that organizations work best when people are in roles that match their actual capabilities, not their ambitions." The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of contract details forthcoming. I returned to my office and looked out at Elliott Bay. Container ships moved across the water, carrying goods across oceans, connecting economies, sustaining supply chains that most people never thought about. Complex systems, built on relationships, requiring expertise. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Miss Hayes, this is Roger Pemberton. I wanted to say thank you for what you said to Bernard, and I wanted to apologize for how I handled the maritime transition. I was arrogant. I'm learning. If you're ever willing to grab coffee and talk about what I could have done differently, I'd appreciate the conversation." I read the message twice, considered deleting it. Instead, I replied, "Coffee works. Wednesday next week, 8 a.m., the place near the terminal." Because grudges are heavy, and life's too short to carry unnecessary weight. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply being so good at what you do, building such strong foundations, cultivating such meaningful relationships, that when someone tries to erase you, the entire structure there standing on starts to crumble. They erased my name from the manifests. They locked my terminal access at 2 a.m. They watched the $420 million pipeline stall at dawn. They tried to freeze me out completely. But I was the vessel lease they couldn't erase. Not because of some technicality in a contract, but because of 4 years of showing up, building trust, delivering on commitments, and understanding that maritime operations are fundamentally about people, not just paperwork. In the end, that's what saved me. Not legal leverage, though that helped. Not corporate politics, though I learned to navigate them. But relationships built on competence, consistency, and respect. Roger learned an expensive lesson about the difference between authority and expertise. The board learned that cost-cutting without understanding operational context is a recipe for disaster. And I learned that sometimes the best protection against betrayal is simply being irreplaceable. Not because you've made yourself indispensable through political maneuvering, but because you've built something real that people actually value. The Empress Catherine is still sailing Pacific routes. The tracking systems I designed are still reducing loss claims. The relationships I built with vessel owners are still opening new opportunities. And I'm still here. Not because I fought to stay, but because when they tried to remove me, they discovered that what I'd built was integrated too deeply into operations to simply delete. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or pushed aside despite your expertise, remember this: build things that matter. Cultivate relationships based on mutual respect. Develop expertise that can't be easily replaced, not as a defensive strategy, but because that's how you create genuine value. And if you found this story valuable, if it reminded you that competence and integrity still matter in professional environments, consider subscribing to the Payback Office channel. We're building a community that believes accountability matters, that expertise deserves respect, and that sometimes the best outcomes emerge when people face the consequences of underestimating others. Help us reach 7,000 subscribers, people who understand that the most powerful position isn't always the highest title, but the one where you've built something real. Thank you for listening to this story. May you always be the vessel lease they can't erase.